And now it's time to welcome our guest. He hasn't spoken out for several weeks. And obviously, on this night of upheaval with this new change in Donald Trump's position, we're very eager to hear his opinion. Our guest is Reza Pahlavi. Good evening. Good evening. Mr. Pahlavi, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. You are, if I remember correctly, the eldest son of the last Shah of Iran, so you are the crown prince. And perhaps because of that and because of your actions, it must be said, you are the most recognized figure of the Iranian opposition in exile. So are you relieved tonight? That will be my first question. With the American decision to give up the massive bombing that they were still announcing in recent days and even last night, or for you, is this a form of backing down?
First of all, I must say that in this experience of the last few months, more than judging words, it is necessary to judge actions. And many times the words were not exactly followed by actions. One thing was said, another was done, and I can only judge by the result. What remains constant in our struggle as Iranians is to free ourselves from this regime. At that moment, an intervention occurred as a consequence. From what happened last January, when more than 45,000 people were killed, massacred by this regime, a defenseless population. And therefore, this intervention was an element that at least started to level the playing field for us a bit. In other words, the regime's attacking forces were largely annihilated. Is that enough for a new uprising to happen, or are there still elements remaining in place that continue to attack the population? The challenge for us is to have the opportunity to witness the last move made by the Iranians to free themselves. But we admit that this intervention helped us a little. But could this continue to the point where the regime would no longer be able to terrorize our population? Aside from the regional and geopolitical issue, which is currently under discussion.
So let's go into a little more detail. But for you, this idea that Donald Trump raised bombing civilian or dual-use infrastructure like power plants and bridges was in a way acceptable? And, in his words, to truly and completely annihilate Iranian civilization in particular.
Yes, I want to be very clear about this again.
You don't want to comment on the statements?
No, I say that targeting the regime's infrastructure and repressive apparatus is, in my opinion, a legitimate action and makes them legitimate targets. Targets, valid targets. But suddenly, the question arises, where should we draw the line? What is acceptable in terms of nationalism? No Iranian patriot would want to see their country's infrastructure destroyed. Is it really necessary? Because, in fact, what are we facing? Let's understand the essence of the problem. We are facing a cruel regime. In its DNA are terrorism, blackmail, hostage-taking, the massacre of innocents, and the celebration of martyrdom instead of life. We, as Iranians, with the same values of humanity, dignity, freedom, and human rights, are completely on the opposite side of this regime. Therefore, when we think about the fact that, to use the words of the American president, there was a regime change. Regime change means the same people may be weakened, but they are the same ones who are in charge of the parliament and the judiciary. Now, Khamenei's son is replacing him. For us, in fact, this is not a regime change. And secondly, I would say that for Iranians, no valid, reliable, or legitimate solution would be the continuation of this regime. For us, there needs to be a definitive break. And why do we say that? Because, unlike this regime, it is a free Iran that can offer the world, not just for ourselves, but an element of stability, peace, and relationships with our neighbors. Instead of the adventures of this regime through its proxies, Hezbollah in Lebanon, Hamas in the region. Anyway, all of this points to the nature of this regime. Can we trust this regime? That's the big question. Can diplomacy solve it? After 47 years judging the behavior of this regime, suddenly it changes completely. I don't see that as reality, but let's see what happens.
right? We understand that you don't really believe these negotiations could lead to regime change, and we understand that you question, that you have big doubts about what Donald Trump had in mind, that is, attacks on civilian infrastructure. Speaking of that regime, do you think you might have made a misjudgment? I would like to understand why you so openly supported an armed intervention, considering that such an action would allow, by weakening the foundations of the current regime, the definitive fall of the government that is currently in power. After almost 6 weeks of bombings, doesn't reality force you to admit that there was a misjudgment?
No. First of all, I would say that we never sought military interventions in our country. But we can't forget that it was this regime that was responsible for bringing our country to the point where we had to suffer attacks from the Israelis and the Americans in this conflict.
But you wanted such interventions.
Because you have to see this from the Iranian point of view. I'm not talking from the American or Israeli perspective in the region. I'm talking from the Iranian point of view. You are being held captive. You are massacred, killed, executed every day, and it's a regime that has taken you hostage. We really need to free ourselves. But can we free a people who took to the streets and ended up being massacred without any help from outside? It's a bit like what people had hoped for, a landing that completely changed the course of history during World War II. There was an intervention that helped France finally free itself.
But doesn't reality actually contradict that?
Because the regime was seriously wounded, weakened. The regime was seriously weakened. Is that enough for a final revolt? Maybe not, but we are much closer. The regime has never been this weak in its entire existence. On the other hand, they have always pursued a policy of buying time, of postponing things, of surviving. An Israeli or American administration to once again reinforce its typical strength.
Do you think that
Today,
this regime is currently more susceptible to being overthrown, while one could also imagine that it has more cards to play today than before the start of the war? Mainly because it holds the power to block the strategic Strait of Hormuz.
but once again, if you notice the shift I've sensed over the past few months, especially in Europe among governments that until now had followed this line, to calm things down, I mean to seek a change in behavior, not to take a decisive position on including the Revolutionary Guard on the list of terrorist organizations. What happened? Whether it was because he had hostages or because of him, because of that? When the German Chancellor, for example, says, this regime ceased to be legitimate after this massacre. This helped that regime to show that after all, we are still here, we are still standing after all this massacre. In the end, there is a moral element that comes into play. I think it's fair to say that, because today, what separates us from finishing the job is to keep going until this regime falls. More attacks against the tools of repression targeting the population. At that moment, you will see that the Iranians will find the right time to act. Our moment will come soon.
What didn't work, sorry to interrupt, could it work with another 6 weeks?
That's it. That depends, once again, if there is cover. Because let's imagine a scenario. These countries said, we'll do part of the job, the rest is up to the Iranians to do, and everyone asks the question. Journalists, parliamentarians, everyone asks, when will the Iranian people rise up? I'm not saying they'll rise up, just at the right moment. By the way, they've already tried, but what were the consequences of that uprising? A total massacre. At this moment, what is the element that allows for fewer human lives to be lost? After all, it's a matter of massacre. You can't expect people to be out on the streets every day being gunned down by agents. At this moment, we need cover. It's possible to do this with technologies like drones and, most importantly, with access to information. Because since January 8th, January 9th, you haven't had any access to information. The network went down. We don't know what's happening in Iran. I, on the other hand, know because we are in contact with our activists on the ground every day. Political prisoners, civil society, lawyers, intellectuals, members of ethnic groups, and the country is ready to fight the final battle. But was it the right moment? Good morning. Absolutely. Listen, too much blood has been shed. I don't think we lost 50,000 people in 2 days just so there could be an American nuclear deal. For us, it's a matter of ending this. We hope that the free world understands that the only solution for us, in fact for our regional neighbors and for the world, is that this regime is no longer in power.
So, to continue the targeted bombings, if we understand correctly?
Targeted without hitting civilian infrastructure, because that's not necessary. That's the logic, and that's where there's a problem with this logic of attacking everyone. Don't countries have the right to attack the regime? That's why Iranians requested intervention. The target isn't the country, but the regime. Let's be very clear. Attacking the regime is not attacking the country. That's where we see the difference.
Last question. Let me put the question another way. Then I'll let each of you ask a question. Wouldn't now be the time, after 5.5 weeks of bombings, to reach out to current or former regime figures seen as less radical? I acknowledge their involvement in the system. But Javad Zarif, for example, who negotiated with the West for a long time on this nuclear issue, or even former President Rouhani, who recently called for reaching out to the West for new talks, saying that the regime would move toward its complete ruin if it continued with total war. Couldn't this internal solution actually become viable?
But they were also part of the massacre. It's not the beginning. The first student movement at the time of Khatami, who was considered the most moderate element, you have to talk to the moderates, people who are more reliable to work with. Even during the Soviet Union era, they used to say that Andropov was much more moderate than, for example, Chernenko.
Gorbachev allowed the final collapse of the Soviet Union.
No, but what I mean is that making people think we can say there are elements in the system that are less bad than others, that doesn't change the nature of the regime. It's a regime that from the beginning brought an element that was antagonistic toward women, toward religious minorities. In short, it was the beginning of an imposed ideology. Besides that, with the idea of exporting it at the expense of the nation, which was first taken hostage, isn't that right? It's not Iran, it's the regime. And these people represented the regime to the Iranian people. The students were thrown out the campus window when they questioned why Khatami's presidential promises were not fulfilled. That was the beginning. The Green Movement, the Woman Life Freedom Movement, and the recent protests. The Iranians came back and were repressed by those who today call themselves moderates. No, they have blood on their hands. That's why I say, for Iran and its people, what matters is total freedom. None of these people can be part of the solution. All of them are elements.
Poorly regarded by you.
Discredited not by me, but by the whole nation.
Your questions, Francois.
Yes, my question is about what would happen next. In other words, the regime fits the conditions you just mentioned. The mullahs, whether moderate, non-moderate, or radical, are removed. A post-mullah transitional regime is established in which you would, if necessary, have to play a role. This transitional regime should have a foreign and security policy. It turns out that yesterday Iran, under the mullahs, presented a 10-point plan, which Trump considered to be a viable basis for discussions with the United States as long as regime change has taken place in Iran. I'm using his words, not mine. Would this 10-point plan be acceptable to you as a basis for foreign policy regarding the Strait of Hormuz, the security regime in the Gulf without the Americans, and so on? Or do you reject the 10 points, including lifting sanctions and unfreezing assets, among others? What's your reaction to that?
First of all, a secular democracy in Iran and the basis of our policy, both internal and external, will depend on the policies adopted by future governments. But in general, what is the national interest of our country? Above all, it's about maintaining friendly relations with our neighbors and stabilizing the region. Without this, we really won't have a chance to get back on the path of progress, to ensure the well-being of the population, create economic opportunities, and rebuild our country. Instead of allowing a dictatorship, this time a military fascist and at the same time corrupt and mafia-like regime, to decide everything for several years. I don't believe that the Revolutionary Guards will show a more conciliatory foreign policy toward the West, that same West they have always threatened. Don't forget that the reason for this regime was founded on an Islamo-Marxist ideology, which brought this regime to power, by definition anti-Western and anti-imperialist, and against the market economy. It has always been an extremely mafia-like system that continues to survive once again through blackmail. Once you have real freedom of expression and a government that, above all, thinks about the well-being of the nation, instead of getting involved in proxy war adventures, wanting to wipe a country off the map, or starting an entire anti-Sunni front. Because this Khomeini, the first thing he did was question the legitimate role of the Saudi family over the Muslim holy sites. That's how it all started. That's why I say the Iranian foreign policy would be based, above all, on the real national interests of our country, but with the goal of cooperation and maintaining healthy relations with the free world above all.
And no privatization of the Strait of Hormuz.
I see how you can accept the fact that, for example, take the example of Spain and Morocco. Gibraltar, for example, is an area where they will start charging fees to cruise ships that leave. It's the same logic. Since when? Tomorrow the British and French will start imposing fees on ships crossing the English Channel. After all, where will this end? That ridiculous argument. Actually, that's just blackmail.
Your Highness, congratulations and thank you for your dignity in these circumstances. The question is, who are your best allies in the international community, and how have your relations been in recent days? Notably with the Trump administration.
You know, allies can be found anywhere. We can find them in Caracas, we can find them in Kyiv, we can find them in Jerusalem, we can find them in Riyadh, we can find them all around the world. Why am I saying this? Because in fact, when you look at the role of this regime in its destabilizing, antagonistic, and terrorist actions, which spread far beyond our region, reaching even the Western Hemisphere, then we find ourselves sharing the same narrative. What does it affect? It affects Ukraine today. We Iranians and Ukrainians have the same enemies. Therefore, consequently, we have common interests. And the Trump administration? The administration, you know, I have survived, after all, 7 American presidents. The first president I met, I was 12 or 13 years old, was President Nixon. So between Nixon and President Trump, I've seen many. They come and go, but something stays. We were talking about Iranian civilization, which has survived for millennia. It's not an administration that's going to decide our future. Understand that well. So I'm not focused on immediate factors. Trump is not the best. No, but Trump makes that kind of statement because he needs to satisfy, after all, his own loyal electorate. We assume that, well, there's the price of oil, there are the elections in the short term, there's nothing new about that. But what's the issue? For me, the point is Europe, because America can say, let's leave the region, we have our own oil, we don't need it anymore. But you still have the same problems. So consequently, it's a continuation of that same regime. Weakened, but now it's a wounded animal ready for revenge. That's the main fear in the region. And that's why I say, the only way to solve the problem, the question is where you have the chance to do it. That doesn't always happen. The truth is that this is a historic opportunity for the world to completely transform itself. And this will be achieved through the liberation of our country and the end of this regime. It's a wounded animal that needs to be sacrificed.
Your Highness, as I said before, at a certain point, the goal was to achieve a secular democracy in Iran. And a few weeks ago, you yourself had the opportunity to say, as one of the most visible opposition figures today, that it would be a transitional temporary mandate.
Exactly.
In your opinion, so far in the specific timeline of this transition, what would be its approximate duration? Are we talking about 1 or 2 years, the time needed to organize elections, or would it be something much longer until an institutional formula that fits Iran is found? Because maybe your country also wants to find its own institutional formula?
Realistically, I firmly believe that the transition period would be about 2 years, actually, at most 3 years. And that also depends on the factors that will determine how quickly decisions are made by the people through this constitutional process. Actually, the transitional government is responsible for temporarily managing the country's affairs. That's why I've always thought that the best way to have a stable transition is to incorporate as many elements as possible into the solution that are not connected to the negative aspects of this regime, who don't have blood on their hands. That includes most of the current bureaucracy. And that could include a large part of the armed forces, both the army and maybe even elements of the Basij, or those people who are not directly guilty, because here there is a matter of justice to be addressed. We saw this at the end of the Truth and Reconciliation process in South Africa. After all, we witnessed the Nuremberg trials. Well, there is an entire legal system that deals with transitional justice. How do we do that? What do we do with the rest of the regime? Anyway, I have a very precise plan for the country's first 100 days, which is explained in a project called IPP, Iron Prosperity Project. But all of this is to finally get to the point that a constituent assembly, which is actually represented by the representatives elected by the people, is the one who will decide on the matter. The constitution, the future form of the regime, all of this finally ratified by a referendum. At that moment, the first parliament and the first government of this new democracy are elected. Whether it's a republic or a parliamentary monarchy, it's the people's decision. At the end of this term, the transitional government ends, handing over power to the parliamentarians and the first elected government. Thus, this cycle comes to an end. Personally, I think all of this can happen within a period of 2 years. The real question is whether the remaining elements that will try to sabotage the process might delay things a bit. It all depends on that as well.
Lastly,
I've been hearing some of your specific criticisms about the Europeans and their constant hesitations. This Franco-European stance of being strictly defensive and not putting enough pressure on the regime. Did you see this a bit as a kind of message to the regime that it could act with impunity? And when you say that the regime is doomed to fall and we see that it doesn't fall, do you think we bear some responsibility for not having been active enough in this, alongside the Americans?
In reality, I must honestly say that this policy of appeasement has brought us exactly to the point where we now have to face the current situation. This didn't happen automatically. Many times a lifeline was thrown to an increasingly illegitimate regime. Look at the country's economic situation. It got to the point where the Iranians said, this game of moderates versus radicals and the reformist movement doesn't work anymore. We don't believe in that anymore. We have to move past this stage.
A lifeline.
would France throw lifelines to Iran?
Anyway, I remember when it all started. Do you know how many Iranian dissidents were killed on French soil? Do you remember the story of Anis Nakache, the assassination of Shapur Bakhtiar, our former prime minister? Or there was also that attack on the Kurdish leader in, what's it called again? Mykonos. I think that was the name of the place at the time. Anyway, there were many others like that. It was at the time when the European governments that wanted to have an approach, a kind of mercantilism with Iran, forgot all those elements. I remember the time when there was Roland Dumas, when there was Genscher, when there was Jack Straw, who traveled between London, Paris and Bonn to Tehran to sell, I don't know, the subway or Airbus planes or all of that. but in the sense that the regime had already started to terrorize our own nation. At that time, people talked about hostage taking, people didn't talk about executions, people didn't talk about this discriminatory side of the regime.
Did they turn a blind eye to you?
They really turned a blind eye. Well, there's always time to fix things, and now is exactly the time to fix them. As for the current French president, I'm glad that the 2 hostages have been released, but we still have millions and millions of hostages in Iran. And who can guarantee that there won't be more hostages taken once again? Who can guarantee us that this regime won't try? It's a bit like the story of the oak and the reed. They want there to be no more Netanyahu in Jerusalem, no more Trump in the White House. Maybe they'll find another opportunity to rebuild themselves. That's where the real threat exists, because once again, the DNA of the regime is the real problem. And that's why I say that what remains of this regime will still have that same DNA. It can't detach itself from this DNA. Because if they continue, let's say, if they manage to accept the supposedly required terms in these negotiations, it's the end of the regime as it currently exists. They can't keep doing what they've done so far. Do you think they're really ready to do that? Are they ultimately ready to completely capitulate? I don't see that. Honestly, I don't see that at all. I think it's an attempt to buy time, and maybe on the other side, the Americans are also trying to buy a little time. I don't interpret the signs that way. I repeat, it's not the end of the game. This match is still ongoing. The final whistle hasn't been blown yet.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Reza Pahlavi, for answering our questions tonight and for doing so in a very direct and frank manner.
Are we live already?
We are live for sure.